Welcome to Radio Free South Africa. This is your host, Karin Smith. Tonight we are continuing with part 4 of our historical figures of South Africa. And tonight we intend to cover Hendrik Verwoerd, the supposed and accepted architect of apartheid, and Nelson Mandela, the supposed huge warrior who destroyed the terrible apartheid system. As always, our guest tonight on this section is Cuan Elgin, author of that fabulous book, Ulala. I'd like to thank Cuan for taking so much time away from his new book to research and to teach us and to help us to educate ourselves on the realities and the truths of these historical figures before history gets changed so much that we no longer have any clue who they really were. Welcome back, Cuan.
Thank you, Karin. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be chatting to you again.
I love having you on, Cuan. We always discover new things, and it's just amazing. And really, I do want to thank you because you are knee deep. In fact, probably in the last phases of your follow-up book to Balala, and probably have way more work to do in order to have an income. So I really do thank you for devoting so many hours to these programs.
It's a pleasure, Karin, and as you well know, one would need a few lifetimes to actually do all the research and reading that one would like to. I'm fortunate in spending a lot of time at our only real classic bookshop in the town where I live, which has a wealth of old books and original documents and treaties. And I discover daily that what was written then in times past is very different to what we are being told now. And yet, when I read those books, I see that at the time they were written, they had no agenda, they had no angle, they were reporting what they saw. So it's wonderful to go back to the original sources and find out what actually happened, rather than the political spin that's been put on events, as you rightly say. Verwoerd himself, Hendrik French Verwoerd, and we'll go into some detail on him personally, but he is regarded to this day as the architect of apartheid. But I will show, and I know you're aware, that he was far from it, the architect of apartheid. That started long before he showed up on the scene, and even the name apartheid came up before he became prime minister. So rightly again, with Mandela, the perception of the world is that he demolished apartheid. Far from it. White prime ministers of South Africa, in fact, demolished apartheid. Mandela was the great icon, essentially a media creation, who stepped onto the world stage. But the perceptions are often skewed, and I'd like to state outright from the beginning, I'm no apologist for apartheid. I grew up right through it. I was born in 1957, and I'm now in my late 50s. So I've lived the entire apartheid era and the 20-odd years since Mandela was released. He was released in 1990, so 26 years ago. So I've seen the whole thing and the whole transition. So I've watched it with great interest, and I never actually voted for the nationalist government in my younger years. Never once ever. With the so-called apartheid government, I always voted for the opposition. But I've always done that. Not always necessarily because I agreed with what the opposition's policies were, but I always felt that a good, strong protest vote against the ruling party would keep them on their toes. So I can say that I never voted in favour of apartheid. But it is a very misperceived era. And there is, and it'll surprise people, there is and was as much good in it as there was bad, and as much good came out of it as bad. And we'll go into that in some detail. But you did right. Verwoerd was not the architect of apartheid. He, you could say, refined it to some extent.
No, absolutely, Cuan, and we have spoken about that on various programs. But a thing that I discovered recently, to my horror, is that one really cannot look. And we're trying so hard to look at South Africa and to educate the world on the realities of South African history and the reality of South Africa today. But
Yes.
you cannot look at South Africa in isolation either, because without understanding what was going on in the whole of Africa at the time of Hendrik Verwoerd's presidency. You really, it makes less sense what happened in South Africa. But if you look at the entirety of Africa and the decolonization everywhere and the murder of white people as the European governments pulled out, people might understand better the horror of white South Africans watching this spreading down Africa towards them and wondering, was this their fate?
You're absolutely right. The British had decided after the Second World War, so from about 1945 onwards, they decided essentially to decolonize. And as you well know, and most people know, they had colonized much of Africa. But they decided to pull out for various reasons, many of them economic. A lot of the colonies were not paying their own way, and Britain was subsidizing them. So they started this process of decolonization quite vigorously from about 1945 to 1951. And unfortunately, the local folk in these mostly black African colonies, although there were trained people amongst them who had been brought up through the system of administration and had some idea of basic governance, the brutes came to the fore, unfortunately, not the educated ones. Yes. And it was the brutes who took over, and as it often happens in Africa, and it descended into absolute chaos. From well-run, reasonably prosperous, or at least reasonable standards of living, people descended into absolute barbarism. And this tide of black liberation moving down through Africa and the chaos that followed it, and the mass murders and the brutality and the attacks on the white settlers and the destruction of the agriculture, destruction of the industry, and the wholesale looting of the countries was watched in absolute horror by most of the world, but particularly South Africa, because at that stage, other than Rhodesia to the north of us, as it was known then, now Zimbabwe, and on the west coast was the Portuguese-controlled Angola, and on the east coast of South Africa, just north and east of us, was Mozambique, Portuguese-controlled. Other than those, which were still controlled by European powers and in a good state and well run, the other countries north collapsed into chaos. I just have to quote, people may not be aware, Zambia, one of the most prolific producers of copper in the world, their president, Kaunda, who the first one voted in by the local populace after the British withdrew. Amongst his first words when he was standing on the podium and receiving the chain of office was, "I want the whites and their God out of this country." People don't know that. He's still alive, amazingly, after all this time. But there was a village not too far from the capital, Lusaka, which was under the control of a religious sect, a Christian religious sect, led by a lady just known as Alice, and she, with a complicated surname which I have, but let's just call her Alice. But there were about 700 people in that village, and she had the temerity to call Kenneth Kaunda, the Antichrist, because of his statement. Well, he had that village surrounded by armed police and everybody massacred the entire village, about 700 of them. A big bulldozer came in, dug a big grave, buried everybody, covered it over, and nothing more was said. To this day, that has not been exposed. This was in the early 60s. Wow. To this day, he's considered an elder statesman of Africa. And there's this council called the Elders of Africa, the sages, the intelligence. So he sat on that council. People haven't exposed him as a mass murderer, but he was the infamous Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. That was much later. Rhodesia held off this tide of black liberation for about 20 years, longer than most of the countries to its north. Declared UDI, as they call it, Unilateral Declaration of Independence from Britain. And then they faced sanctions and a bush war, terrorist incursions, etc. And it was terrorism. They called them freedom fighters. But genuine freedom fighters have no need to slaughter civilians and torture and maim and kill civilians, no matter how just they consider their cause. So it was terrorism. And north of them, of course, was the Mau Mau in Kenya. They are pretty famous or infamous for their modus operandi was to hack the tendons of the cows to cripple them, and then but they'd stay alive, and they would hack meat off them to barbecue and call it a bush fridge because the cow was still alive, and the meat would then stay fresh. And they were absolutely brutal, barbaric, and very much into their dark arts and black magic, etc. And yet, the Mau Mau, who were so prominent in people's imaginations as the epitome of barbaric terrorism in Africa, killed. There was just over 200 white settlers in the entire period. Yet they killed over 2,000 in Zimbabwe, white settlers, and it was hardly known. And South Africa, to this day, tens of thousands since the current government's taken over the ANC. So it was actually a tiny drop in the ocean of blood, the Mau Mau. With all this happening, South Africa had a jaundiced eye on the north, watching this tide of black nationalism moving down and wondering, as you rightly say, whether this was going to be the fate of South Africa. And there's an excellent movie which I would urge everyone to watch, which is available on YouTube. It's got to hunt around a bit. And some of them have English subtitles. That's the one to go for. One has got an English voice over, so you've got to hunt around. I think it's called the director's cut. It's called Africa Addio, sometimes spelled Afrika or CA, and then ADDIO, Africa Addio. And it was filmed in around about 1960 by a group of Italian journalists traveling down through Africa and filming as they went. They basically followed the tide of liberation moving down through Africa, and what they saw and what they documented, fortunately, is still available to be seen because it is a real eye-opener. And it should be watched by anyone who has any interest in Africa and in the world history. It's brilliant, and it's as I say, a real eye-opener. So this is what the South African government of the day was seeing, and the Rhodesian government of the day was seeing. So they decided there's absolutely no way they're going to allow this kind of barbarism to break out in southern Africa when it reaches here. They are going to stand firm, and at that stage, South Africa was very, very much under the control of the white minority, and at that stage, the whites were about 20% of the population. Then they're now down to 8% because the numbers of the black folk have increased exponentially, and the numbers of the white folks have either stayed stable or decreased as people have left. So they're down to about 8% now. So very much a very small minority, but they always were. But either way, Britain made it clear that nothing less than black majority rule would be accepted in Rhodesia and then ultimately in South Africa. The Portuguese on the east coast and the west coast, Mozambique and Angola, also fought against terrorism. Their people were brutally attacked, murdered and maimed, and the women were ravaged. It was a chaotic time. But in South Africa, in that same period, and this is now the early 60s we're talking about, it was a time of absolute boom. In fact, one could almost say it was South Africa's heyday in the 60s. Britain was represented by Harold Macmillan. He came out here to South Africa, and he made a famous speech, which is often misquoted in the sense that people talk of the winds of change speech. In actual fact, he said the wind of change.
Yes, yes.
let's get that right. But he basically, this is what he said. He said the wind of change is blowing through this continent, that's Africa. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. So they were pragmatic, the British. They realized that there was no way that they could support a country like South Africa, which had a minority white government, although the majority of whites voted for the government. The whites themselves were a minority, as I mentioned, same thing in Rhodesia. Although Rhodesia had a slightly different, or somewhat different voting system. They had a qualified franchise system. So if you had a university degree, you got a certain amount of votes. If you had just a high school, you got a certain amount of lesser number of votes. If you were a registered taxpayer, property owner, etc., etc. So it went down. So in actual fact, those who were the most qualified and the biggest contributors to the economy had the most votes. So they had their system, although nobody was banned from voting if they qualified. So it was a qualified franchise, and many believed that was the only viable, sensible method of democracy in Africa. And it worked for them very well. And they became an absolutely prosperous country. It was known as the breadbasket of Africa, Rhodesia, and they were doing exceedingly well economically. There was the people got along very well amongst themselves. It might surprise people that the Rhodesian army, which was fighting this wave of black nationalism coming in and terrorism, there were far more black soldiers in the Rhodesian army than there were white. So it wasn't a matter of whites versus blacks at all. It was a matter of Christian civilization versus barbarism, terrorism, and communism. Because the black liberation movements, as they like to call themselves, were sponsored by China and Russia, Soviet Union in those days, and armed by them. So it was very much a communist pincer movement moving down towards South Africa, which had long been a target, especially for the Soviet Union, because it controlled the sea route around the Cape. And if the Suez Canal, for any reason, was impossible, all the shipping of the world from east to west had to come around South Africa. So very important strategically, and also South Africa is an absolute treasure chest of minerals, many of them strategic minerals like uranium and platinum and chrome, and which is in itself a strategic mineral because you can't make stainless steel without chrome. So it goes on. So South Africa was the prize, the glittering prize for the communist world, and Rhodesia was essentially just in the way. So was Mozambique. So was Angola. Well, the Mozambique and Angolan Portuguese colonies collapsed because their government in Portugal essentially became a communist government, and they withdrew support for the white, mostly Portuguese armies there. Although they had a lot of black soldiers fighting on their side as well, who were not interested in being under the heel of communism. They withdrew support, and so it collapsed and into civil war, which took quite a while to sort out, and eventually ended up with this socialist Marxist type government in Angola and in Mozambique to this day. But Rhodesia stood firm for a lot longer, and South Africa and America supported Rhodesia for quite a long time in terms of supplying fuel and armaments, but then the Americans eventually withdrew their support. Britain instituted sanctions. South Africa eventually was forced by the United States to stop supplying fuel and arms to Rhodesia, and so eventually it was inevitable that it had to collapse as well, which it did. And Robert Mugabe, who was for a while the darling of the West, became the Prime Minister after Ian Smith, and he has led Zimbabwe to disaster, as everybody well knows. In fact, right at the moment, our headlines are dominated by scenes of burning and looting and rioting in Zimbabwe. It's really imploding now. They're starving. The currency collapsed long ago, and they started using US dollars. Those have all been whipped off to China and India by the traders, and there's very little actual currency left now to trade with. So they're descending back to the Stone Age, and it's a real problem. It's right on our border. But the man we want to talk about, Hendrik French Verwoerd, he was became Prime Minister of South Africa in 1958 until 1966 when he was assassinated. And we will go into some detail there. But he saw a lot of this period. The strange thing is he wasn't born in South Africa. I know there was a lot of controversy about the United States President Obama's birthplace, but in fact everybody knew Verwoerd, Hendrik French Verwoerd, as he was called, was born in the Netherlands, which made him the only South African Prime Minister who wasn't born in the country. And he was the second child of a Dutch couple. He had an older brother called Leon Dutch, known as Len, and a younger sister called Lucy. His father was a shopkeeper and a deeply religious man. They moved to South Africa when he was essentially a babe in arms. He was born in 1901, Hendrik French Verwoerd, and in 1903 they moved to South Africa, mainly because of his father's sympathy towards the Afrikaner nation just after the Second Anglo-Boer War, which had ended the year before. And it had created an entire class of poor whites. The British modus operandi, when they realized they couldn't defeat the Boer commandos in the veldt, began burning the Boer farms, cutting down the orchards, poisoning the wells, killing the livestock or confiscating it, and herding the Afrikaner or Boer, and I'll give the distinction that they're essentially Afrikaans-speaking people called Boers, who were herded into these concentration camps, the women and children, and the non-combatants, where they died in their droves. Almost a third of the people who, and there were over 100,000 herded into these camps. A third of them died, and almost half the children of the Afrikaner nation, the Boer nation, died in these camps. It was a shocking time. They were essentially extermination camps, although they were called concentration camps. And the British war on the Boers was genocide. Either way, at the end of that war, eventually weight of arms prevailed, and Britain won the war, you could say. But they had essentially destroyed a nation, the two little Boer republics, who were standing up against the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and managed to hold them off for 2.5 years against an army that at stages outnumbered them 10-1.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it created a whole class of Boer whites. There were landowners before that, farmers, Boers as they're called, simply the Dutch word for farmer, the Boers. And they were landowners and doing reasonably well, and very successful farmers in the sense that South Africa is mostly semi-arid, and yet they managed to farm very successfully. But this destroyed them as an agricultural landowning people, and to a large extent, and many had to move into the cities and look for work in the mines, etc. And they ended up really as second-class citizens in their own country under British administration. So there was a lot of sympathy for them from America. America supported the Boers during the Anglo-Boer War as Republicans themselves. So did the French, so did the Russians, so did and this is the Russians under the Tsar, not the communist Russians, and so did France, etc. So they had a lot of international support. And there was an attempt to try and uplift these poor whites who really didn't have the skills to work in towns or work in the mines. They were farmers. And one of the people who had such sympathy towards them was the father of Hendrik French Verwoerd. They moved to South Africa, as mentioned, in 1903. He went to a primary school in Wynberg, which is a suburb of Cape Town. And then a few years later, 1912, the Verwoerd family moved to Bulawayo, which was then Rhodesia, one of the bigger cities there, where his father became an assistant evangelist in the Dutch Reformed Church. And Hendrik Verwoerd attended high school there, and he was awarded a scholarship, did extremely well. And although he was essentially Dutch-speaking, Afrikaans being a form of Dutch, which he would have picked up pretty quickly, even though his parents at that stage still probably spoke pure Dutch. Afrikaans is very similar. So he would have picked it up. He was still a young boy when they came, and he received the top marks in English literature in the whole of Rhodesia, which had a very high standard of education. So it was noted early on that he was a brilliant scholar. And in 1917, the family moved back to South Africa, and his father took up a position in a church, the Dutch Reformed Church in Brantford in the Orange Free State. And eventually Verwoerd matriculated in 1919, receiving as a top scholar in the Orange Free State and fifth in the whole of South Africa. So he was definitely a bright scholar. He then proceeded to do a BA in theology. He wanted to do a theology, and he applied for admission to the theology school, but he did graduate with a BA there, and he was awarded honours, and he then changed to psychology and philosophy, and he was awarded a master's degree, cum laude. He served on the Students' Council, and that time he met his wife, who was to be his wife, a lovely young lady called Betsy Schkumbi. And he eventually got his doctorate, also cum laude, and he was awarded 2 scholarships for further postdoctoral studies abroad for Oxford University, and another one for Germany. And he opted for the latter in Germany, and he studied in the universities of Hamburg, Berlin, Leipzig, and he, at that time, of course, the Nazis were coming to power, and it's been claimed that Verwoerd studied eugenics, racial genetics, during his German sojourn, but that's never been confirmed. But if he did, he studied it more from a biological perspective. And interestingly, and it's not recorded, but I was told this by someone who knew him. He's still alive, a good friend of mine, and he knew Verwoerd quite well. And he said that once Verwoerd was asked by a journalist, almost trying to trap him in a sense, when he had become Prime Minister already, and said, "Are you a white supremacist?" And he looked at the man quite surprised, and he said, "No, not in the least." He said, My studies have shown me that the biological differences between the races are negligible, but I have seen that they are at very different stages of development." I thought that was a pretty good answer. And he was right, of course. We had a massive black population who were emerging from the bush, you could say. They had no written language up until the white settlers gave it to them. So they only had the oral tradition. They were not sophisticated. A few were well educated. A few had studied at universities, but the general populace was not well educated and not very much informed. So he was quite right. They were at a different stage of development, and he took essentially a patriarchal view of the black tribes, and he said that he would like to assist them to develop. He had a completely different approach to the races as he's been portrayed to have. He's been portrayed sort of like it's almost like a Nazi,
Yes.
In a sense of white supremacy and so on, but not at all. And he saw that the Caucasians had developed the highest social civilization, and that they should use this to assist the other races or the other population groups to try and reach a higher level of civilization. So he took it upon himself as an almost a calling, and in a patriarchal way and a benevolent way. Anyway, his studies continued, and he married Betsy, returned to South Africa after his studies, appointed the chair of applied psychology and psychology techniques at the University of Stellenbosch, and 6 years later became professor of sociology and social work. And during the Great Depression, he became active in social work, as I mentioned, among the poor white South Africans, devoted much of his attention to welfare work and welfare and cultural organizations. And he became eventually the editor of the Transvala, which was quite a big but new newspaper, which supported the aspirations of Afrikaner nationalism and agricultural and labor rights. So he became their chief editor, and he soon learned that his strength perhaps was in public speaking and convincing people and motivating people. He's very good at that. And he eventually moved into politics. And I have looked at so much literature on him from his day and later. And one in particular struck me. It was a photo biography, you could say, of what hundreds of photographs of his life and his political career. And in virtually every photograph, he has got a broad smile, a lit-up face.
Yes.
His wife is this lovely little woman. They were very much in love. They had a lot of children together. He was a real family man, and he was loved by his people. He seemed to almost glow. He had an incredible, intelligent light in his eyes. He had a charisma about him. I have, as I say, spoken to people who knew him, and I was very young when he was assassinated. I was 9 years old, so I don't remember him particularly well from my youth. What I do remember, though, and I just have to go back a few years on this, I remember when President Kennedy was assassinated. I was at school. I just started school in Mauritius, of all places, in Indian Ocean Island. We'd gone there for a couple of years. My dad was building houses for them, and they just gained their independence from Britain, also early 60s. And President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. And I remember walking into the dining room of our home and seeing my mom and my dad sitting around the table with the radio playing and crying, tears streaming down their faces. And I said, what's wrong? They said, President Kennedy has been assassinated. So I was quite shocked by that. I knew who he was and what he looked like, etc. They were very upset. And so strange, 3 years later, almost an identical scenario, but we were back in South Africa by then. Walked into the dining room, they were listening to the radio, tears streaming down their faces, and I said, what's wrong? And they said, Prime Minister Verwoerd, Hendrik Verwoerd, has been assassinated. That was our Prime Minister in South Africa. I knew who he was. So it was kind of upsetting for me as a young person to see this. And bear in mind, my parents were English-speaking, not Afrikaans-speaking. They were not Boers, they were not Afrikaners.
Yeah.
They probably voted against his government or his party, but yet they still saw him as a good man, an honest and forthright man, and he was the leader of the country. So they were reduced to tears by this terrible assassination. So, to go back a bit, to call him the architect of apartheid is a complete a misnomer. And I'll just give a couple of stats here. He was born in 1901, as we mentioned, but in 1809, so that's almost 100 years before he was even born, the British passed the Native Land Act in the Cape of Good Hope, which compelled black people to carry passbooks, as they called them, which is essentially like an ID document. Nothing wrong with that. But they say that was the first building block in apartheid, although the name apartheid, the title, only came much later. In 1865, so that's 36 years before he was born, Sir Theophilus Shepstone, British Governor of the Cape, prohibited black people prohibited black people in Natal from voting. 36 years before Verwoerd was born. In 1894, Cecil John Rhodes, Governor of the Cape, prevented a coloured man from joining the South African cricket tour to England. So, apartheid in sport. This is now 7 years before Verwoerd was born. In 1905, Verwoerd was now 4 years old. 1902, so he was a year old. Just before Rhodes died, he compelled schools in the Cape to separate white and black pupils. Apartheid in education. When Verwoerd was a babe in arms. He hadn't even come to South Africa yet. In 1913, the Native Land Act, or the Glen Grey Land Act as they call it, which is perceived as prohibiting black people from owning land, which is actually a complete misleading perception, because it wasn't at all. What it did was secure homelands for the black tribes. So rather than take any land from anyone, it actually secured land for them. What it did do is prevent black people from buying land in areas that had been put aside for whites. So apartheid in land ownership, 1913, when Verwoerd was all of 12 years old. So he couldn't have been responsible for that. In 1925, Minister H.W. Sampson promulgated the Act on Labour Demarcation to divide black and white. So 1925, Verwoerd was still at university. There was apartheid in the labour law. So once again, he couldn't be blamed for that. In 1927, the Immorality Act was promulgated in Natal to prohibit intimacy between black and white. So Verwoerd still in university at that stage, nothing to do with that. So apartheid in terms of sexual relations, can't blame him for that. But I can go back and say that as early as the previous century, the British were very upset that Johannesburg, which at that stage was still a young boom town after the gold discoveries, that prostitutes, or ladies of the night, they call them, were flooding in from all over the world to take advantage of this sudden prosperity there, this gold rush. And blacks were flooding into the town as well, looking for work, and there was a fair bit of trade between black customers and white prostitutes. And the Kruger government at the time was horrified. So were the British. And when they took over Johannesburg, they made sure that this didn't go on. So it wasn't all invented by dear old Hendrik Verwoerd, that's for sure, the so-called apartheid architect. He wasn't at all. And, excuse me, in 1936, there was separate representation in Parliament, which was promulgated by General Jan Smuts. So once again, Hendrik Verwoerd had absolutely nothing to do with that. In 1945, the Native Urban Areas Act prohibited blacks from staying in white suburbs for longer than 72 hours unless they had a job there. They couldn't just be there. In other words, they couldn't loiter there. So apartheid in residential areas, again, reinforced. Once again, nothing to do with Hendrik Verwoerd. And it's strange that he's considered the architect of apartheid, because in actual fact, what he did was refine it, and in many senses, and I'll go into some detail on that, he softened it in many ways, took away some of the harshness, but we'll go into some detail. But at that time, it was a time of unprecedented prosperity in South Africa. Inflation rate was at 2%. It was one of the lowest in the world. The national growth rate was over 6%. It was the second highest in the world. The rand, which came into being around that time from the British pound in the rand, was twice as strong as the US dollar, twice as strong. It took $2 US to buy one South African rand. It was almost as strong as the English pound. It was 2 rand to the pound. So it was a very strong currency. the standard of living of all South Africans was amongst the highest in the world. That's black and white South Africans, and certainly the standard of living of black South Africans was far higher than any other blacks anywhere in Africa.
Yes.
So that was the good side. The bad side everybody heard about, but we'll get into that. But the country was booming, and I'll just give some stats. This is where it goes on after Verwoerd, but if he was the architect of apartheid, as people perceive him to be, let's rather say that he refined it. But what came out of it in 1972, so this was only 6 years after he was assassinated, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is the apartheid era we're talking about now, supposedly started by him. In 1972, South African blacks owned 360,000 vehicles. That's more than all the black African states put together. The monthly income of blacks per capita was around 300 Rand a month in South Africa. In our neighboring countries, it was 20 Rand a month. So it was 300 Rand a month here, 20 Rand a month there. In the 1980s, so we've moved on a bit, but still under the apartheid era, black people could undergo complicated heart valve surgery for $1. At that time, the black American would have had to pay $15,000. In a Pretoria hospital, 2,000 or 3,000 of these surgeries were done per annum. In 1970, black workers earned a total of 1.751 million or 1.7 billion, or 25% of the total wage fee in South Africa, and that increased exponentially, 1,000% growth over the next 10 years. But then who was paying the tax?
Yes.
In the 86, 87, so that's getting towards the end of apartheid. Apartheid essentially, most of it was done away with within a year or so of that time. So this is 86, 87 financial year. Whites paid 9,000 million Rand in tax, and blacks paid 171 million. So 9,000 million as opposed to 171 million. So, who was carrying the bill? Let's ask. Between 1962, so that was the time of Verwoerd, until 1972, the UN paid $298 million to undeveloped countries. In that same period, South Africa paid $558 million, virtually double, for the development of its black areas. So South Africa, one country, spent almost double on developing black areas or undeveloped areas, populated mostly by blacks, double what the UN spent towards undeveloped countries. The budget for black education increased every year by almost 30%. It was just exponential. The number of black scholars from 1955, that's just before Verwoerd took over, to 1984, the number of black scholars increased from 35,000 to 1.1 million. In 1988, 71% of the adult black population could read and write, as opposed to 47% in Kenya, 38% in Egypt, and 34% in Nigeria. So South Africa was at that stage, along with Rhodesia, the most literate population, including the blacks, in the whole of Africa. In 1985, so that's deep into the apartheid era, 42,000 black graduate students at South African universities. There were 5 black universities put aside for blacks, and 28 higher education institutes, all funded by the government, of which, as we mentioned, the whites paid 98% of the tax. Soweto had a population of roughly 1 million, and had 5 modern stadiums, sports stadiums, against Pretoria, the capital city, which had 3. Soweto had 365 schools versus Pretoria, the white capital, of 200. In Soweto in 1978, in the depths of apartheid, there were 115 football fields, 3 rugby fields, 4 athletic tracks, 11 cricket fields, 2 golf courses, 47 tennis courts, 7 swimming pools, 5 bowling alleys, 81 basketball fields, 39 children's playgrounds, and countless community halls, cinemas, and clubhouses. So Soweto was not a shack town, a shanty town by any means, and in fact very sturdy houses by the tens of thousands were built there under Hendrik Verwoerd. And interestingly, those houses, which were called matchbox houses, but they were far from it, they were very small, but they were very sturdy, and they were given to the black population for a very nominal rental. And they are still standing to this day because they were so solidly built. Whereas the current government, the ANC, the RDP houses, as they call them, redevelopment houses, are falling down already within 5 or 10 years of being built, and they're smaller. So there's a lot of hypocrisy. And strangely, I took a group of tourists once to Mandela's house in Soweto. And we'll be speaking about Mandela later, but just a quick aside. And the guide was saying, can you imagine that the great Madiba, that's his sort of pet name, was actually his clan name, had to live in this little house while he was studying to do his articles to be a lawyer, this great man. And an Australian tourist behind me, who was a lawyer himself, he said, well, it's a damn sight better than my digs when I was doing my articles. And he said, and didn't he get it for free? We said, well, virtually. He said, well, he had to pay for his. So, there's a lot of misperceptions.
Yeah.
But either way, it goes on. The government built a huge hospital, the biggest one in Africa, 3,000 beds at that stage in Soweto, one of the largest and most modern hospitals in the world. It had 23 operating theatres, equipped with the very best equipment money could buy. Blacks were treated on average at normal cost of R2 for an unlimited period. In 1 year alone, 900 heart surgeries done there. As I mentioned, you could have a heart operation for $1 because it was so heavily subsidized. There was an eye clinic next door, famous for the treatment of glaucoma, etc. In Soweto itself, there were a couple of thousand registered companies, 1,000 taxi operators, 50,000 car owners in Soweto itself. There were more black people owning cars in Soweto itself, in the heart of the apartheid era, than the entire private car ownership in the Soviet Union. One city.
Wow.
So, a lot of misperceptions. A Canadian physician, Dr. Kenneth Walker, actually visited Soweto to have a look at the medical facilities, and he made some observations, and he said there were luxury houses with BMWs and Mercedes in the front yard. He expected a shanty town. He came across a prosperous city. Not all of it, as all cities are. There are areas with low-cost housing, which the government had built subsidized, and there were areas where people had built on or built their own homes. There were luxury homes. I've been to Soweto many times. I've seen magnificent homes. Only 2% of the homes would be considered shacks. The rest were neat suburban homes with lawns. Not all, but in the better areas. And there was schools and churches and sports fields and more than any other independent African state in one city, Soweto. The propaganda, the negative and false propaganda that's been put out over the decades about the apartheid era is shocking, and it's time people did their own research. It really is a very different picture to perhaps what they were taught. All the same, as I say, I'm no apologist for apartheid. As a young person, I thought, well, what is all this nonsense? If people want to live together, they'll live together. If they want to live apart, they'll live apart. And I think that's the crux: is enforced social segregation is social engineering, as much as enforced social integration is social engineering. Yes. So if one is wrong, surely the other is. And if people want to live apart, I would say let them. That was my attitude. But all the same, Verwoerd had a meteoric rise through his academic years. He was considered one of the brightest men in the country, and he, as I mentioned, ended up as the editor-in-chief of quite a big newspaper, the Transvaal. But in 1958, just to describe him physically, he was a big man, a big, fair-haired, blue-eyed man, quite a good-looking man in his youth, and he had a real presence about him, a lot of charisma. He became the Prime Minister of South Africa. An attempt was made on his life quite early in his tenure as Prime Minister. He was attending what we call the Rand Easter Show. It's a big agricultural and commercial show quite close to Johannesburg. And he was shot twice in the head at very close range by somebody who turned out to be deranged and who committed suicide in prison, but an English-speaking farmer, actually, because he said Verwoerd was the epitome of apartheid. He had a very radical view, and he shot him twice in the head with a small caliber pistol, and miraculously, Hendrik Verwoerd survived. He was incarcerated in hospital for a while, but he came right, and people thought this might affect his courage, it might affect his mental perceptions, but he healed completely, and he was the same man he was before, except he realized perhaps that there were desperate people out there who didn't want to see this country go the way he had in mind. So he survived that. Around about the time was the infamous Sharpeville massacre, as history has
Yes.
recorded it. Well, this was just a year before the declaration of the Republic of South Africa. Was, as I say, Verwoerd oversaw almost the heyday of South Africa and momentous events. He oversaw our first nuclear facility being built. He oversaw the construction of Soweto, our first major armaments industry being built, massive dams being built, huge infrastructure being laid on, the deepest mines in the world being dug. This was all under Verwoerd. And he took South Africa out of the Commonwealth. He actually wanted us to stay in the British Commonwealth, but he put it to a referendum and asked the people of the country, did they want to be a republic or did they want to stay under Britain? And with a small majority, it was voted to become a republic. And in 1961, that was the case. And yet he wanted South Africa perhaps to stay in the Commonwealth, which word was coined, by the way, by Jan Smuts, one of our earlier prime ministers, who we spoke about some time ago. And he went to the UK, and there was a vote amongst the Commonwealth members whether South Africa should be allowed to stay or not. And the members, in particular India, voted against South Africa staying in. And then, oddly enough, Ethiopia, who South Africa had basically freed from colonialism, Italians at Abyssinia, and the other one was Libya, which South African troops had also freed from German and Italian occupation during the war, oddly. And then Israel had a lot to say about the South African apartheid system or the apartheid state. But if I could just quote what was said here in 1961, I'm quoting from an encyclopedia, in 1961, dismissing an Israeli vote against South African apartheid at the UN, Hendrik Verwoerd famously said, quote, Israel is not consistent in its new anti-apartheid attitude. They took Israel away from the Arabs after the Arabs lived there for 1,000 years. However, in that, I agree with them. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state. That was what he had to say about them voting against South Africa as an apartheid state.
Yeah.
So he was a very perceptive man, and yet he did make enemies, that's for sure. And this early attempt on his life, as I say, which failed, was around the time of the Sharpeville massacre, as it's been recorded in history. But what actually happened there, and this is now, if one bothers to do any research, you will find out it's a very different scenario to the one that was painted. The one that's painted is the police opened fire on a peaceful mob of protesters and killed 69 of them and injured many more. That's the perception. So it was a brutal white supremacist attack, etc. Absolutely rubbish.
Children,
there were black policemen there as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, Karen?
Yeah, the perception is it was an attack by the police on children.
Yes,
white
quite
police
wrong.
On black
They were
children.
adults. There were children amongst them, but they were virtually all adults. And it was a mob of between 6,000 and 10,000 black people protesting against a law which compelled them to carry identification passes, allowing them to work in white areas. Now, I don't see the problem with carrying an identity document, or with myself, but either way, they were burning these documents and protesting, and they surrounded a police station near a town called Sharpeville in the Transvaal. And the perception the world has is that the police, unprovoked, opened fire on them and killed all these poor peaceful protesters. Well, I've done my research, and in my book Bulala, which you mentioned, thank you, earlier, Bulala, B-U-L-A-L-A, which is actually a Zulu word for destroy or kill, and there's good reason why the book is called that. But either way, the mob surrounded this police station, and they were chanting and in a very threatening manner. And if I can quote from Bulala, I'll just read a paragraph or two, if I might. Just a year before the declaration of the Republic of South Africa, an event occurred at Sharpeville in the Transvaal in 1960, which would resonate around the world and forever after be used as anti-Afrikaner propaganda. A mob of about 6,000 blacks protesting against a law which compelled them to carry identification passes surrounded a police station. The ostensibly peaceful demonstration turned ugly when a woman inserted a gasoline-soaked rag in the fuel receptacle of a police vehicle and then lit it. The resultant explosion panicked the small contingent of besieged policemen, already on edge due to the fact that 9 young policemen, of whom half were black, had recently been hacked and burned to death by a mob near Durban, one of our other major cities. And I might mention that this so-called peaceful mob, and I will continue with the quote, but I have seen photographs in my research of the weapons that the police gathered up after this so-called massacre. And there were truckloads, literally truckloads of what we call pangas, they are machetes, sharpened pipes, spears, clubs. If it had not been a massacre, so-called, of protesters, it would have been a massacre of policemen.
Yes.
So that's the skewed perception that history has been given, that these police, unprovoked, killed these people. I'll go on. The commander at Sharpeville ordered his policemen to be ready to shoot, but only if the masses broke down the fence around the police station, their last line of defense. When the mob stormed through the fence, and I might mention, I've since found out, and I'll mention in the sequel to Balala, that one of the crowd actually took a shot at the policeman, and his name, I've actually got his name. He was a known criminal with an illegal weapon, and he took a shot at a policeman standing in the doorway of the police station, and the shot struck just above the door. However, the mob stormed through the fence, and the firing broke out from the police. 69 of the rioters were killed. The senior police commander, Lieutenant Colonel Pinar, later told the Commission of Inquiry into the so-called Sharpeville massacre that, quote, the native mentality, he meant black people, the native mentality does not allow for a peaceful demonstration. For them to gather together means violence. And although the white Afrikaner, or the Boer, had by virtue of their more than 3 centuries of contact with black Africans, they could claim to know them better than any other white nation did. But a liberal media spin on these events led to a worldwide perception that the Afrikaners were violent white supremacists, and thus international sanctions against them were necessary. So that was during Verwoerd's time, and it was not an auspicious start to the 60s, and South Africa then came under the world spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Either way, to their credit, the white nationalists did allocate many of the most beautiful and fertile regions of their own country, including some of the most scenic coastal areas, for the sole habitation of the black tribes, and encouraged them to be ruled by their own chiefs within those homelands. They were not reservations in the American sense. These were fully fledged homelands with infrastructure paid for by the white nationalists, and in the form of reservoirs, hospitals, civic buildings, industry, even airports. And some of them were absolute treasure chests of minerals, precious minerals. So they had every opportunity to actually flourish, but unfortunately they didn't. And the world decided these were what they called the Bantu-stans, and this couldn't be allowed. And so it went on. But Hendrik Verwoerd ruled the country very wisely for the time. It was a very different time in the world, and in America, don't forget, there was still segregation. So it wasn't too different in South Africa. Segregation in America lasted to the 60s, and in South Africa until the 80s, so only 20 years difference there. And it might interest many Americans that slavery, if we can go back that far, was abolished in South Africa 30 years before it was abolished in the United States. So there's many correlations and parallels between our histories. But either way, he ruled wisely. Many people thought he was very popular amongst most people. He was a very clever and engaging man. Anyone who met him and spoke with him was very impressed immediately by his intellect and his clear thinking. And he did earn, to some extent, the label of being one of the apartheid's architect, because he promulgated a number of rules. He was first the Minister of Native Affairs, it was called in the cabinet, or Bantu Affairs, and then he became the Prime Minister. But he promulgated the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act of 1959, which laid the cornerstone for the classification of black South Africans into 8 ethnic tribes. It's now 9. They were, in fact, in those tribes already, but it gave them their homelands. So some would say that was a very good thing. He started the Bantu Investment Corporation, which was to draw funds from white South Africa to invest in these black homelands, and the extension of University Education Act, which established new universities and tertiary institutions for black folk. The Republic had been declared, and South Africa, which had been under British rule on and off for well over a century, was now finally a republic. The second attempt at an assassination of Verwoerd, which was, to use a word, successful, was in 1966. And and that is 3 years after Kennedy, of course, was assassinated. And he was in Parliament at just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he was attacked by a messenger with a large dagger by the name of Dimitri Tsefendas, who was the offspring of a white Portuguese Mozambican and an African woman, and he was no little nobody, this chap. There's been a lot of theorizing and research into who he actually was and where he came from. It turned out he was quite well educated. He spoke 5 or 6 languages. He spent time in London. He had been under the wing of quite a few organizations, shady organizations. So there's a lot of theorizing that, in fact, this was a much bigger plot. In the same way, many people would regard the Kennedy assassination, that it wasn't just a lone assassin acting on his own volition, or somebody what we'd call a nutter, let's say, a loose cannon, but that there was a lot more to this. But either way, he had access to Parliament because he was a messenger, and he managed to smuggle in a very large dagger. And while the Prime Minister Verwoerd was speaking at the podium, he attacked him and he stabbed him 4 times, once in the neck and 3 times in the body. And it turned out in later investigations that he was highly trained in knife fighting. So this was not just
random.
There was more to this. Either way, he was overpowered and arrested. The Prime Minister bled to death, essentially, and he was hugely mourned. As I say, I remember my parents, who were certainly not supporters of his national party, crying copious tears because the Prime Minister Verwoerd, who everybody loved, despite the fact that not everybody agreed with the policies of his party, had been stabbed to death. They tried to resuscitate him. He was rushed to the Groote our main hospital, Cape Town, but pronounced dead on arrival. Tsefendas escaped the death penalty because he was on the grounds of insanity, and he was in prison indefinitely, as they call a state president's patient, as a mental patient in a secure mental institution. And he always said, Tsefendas, that he was told what to do by a giant tapeworm in his stomach.
Yes.
Very strange. Yes. So people assume, well, the man's crazy. So that he wasn't executed, but he stayed in this secure mental institution for the rest of his life. But he did eventually die after the South Africa had fallen out of the ANC, and they offered him his release, and he was then pretty much a hero to the ANC because he'd assassinated the white nationalist president, prime minister. Later they changed the title to president, but he stayed in the prison because he had nowhere to go, really, and he eventually died in the prison. But Verwoerd's state funeral was attended by 250,000 people, 250,000 people. It was held in Pretoria on the 10th of September 1966, and his flag-draped coffin towed on an artillery carriage by a military truck, and he was buried in what's called Heroes Acre in Pretoria. But the nation was plunged into mourning. It was a very dark time. The person who had to take over for him was known as B.J. Foster, John Foster. B.J. Foster, as he was known, became the next Prime Minister by default, essentially. And South Africa went into mourning. This hugely popular man died a horrible death in Parliament. There was an obituary, which, if I could just quote from it, which was published in the Transvaal, which was the newspaper he had been the chief editor of in his time as a newspaper editor before he went into politics, and it was the leading article in the Transvaal the day after he was assassinated. And if I could read it, it was written in Afrikaans. This is an English translation. The Republic of South Africa grieves and has been plunged into mourning, for one of the greatest calamities which could occur at this stage actually overtook us. This was just a few days after his assassination. This was that the man who was called on the 2nd of September 1958 to be the chief citizen of this country has died at the hand of a murderer. This happened only 2 days before Dr. Verwoerd's 65th birthday. Goes on to say, South Africa is not a country accustomed to political assassinations, Such deeds are against the Christian beliefs of the people of South Africa, and just because of this, it is incomprehensible why 2 attacks were made on the life of Dr. Verwoerd. The first occurred in April 1960, but as if through a miracle at the hands of God, Dr. Verwoerd survived and was able to serve his people and country for more than another 6 years. Now there has been another attack on him, and this one has been successful. This is a blow from which the Republic will not easily recover. Dr. Verwoerd was a man of outstanding personality. In him, South African statesmanship undoubtedly reached a height which will not easily be surpassed. Gifted with a clear and brilliant intellect such as few people possess, inspired by a firmness of principle which commanded the admiration of friends and foe alike, and born with all the qualities which can be required of a leader of his people, Dr. Verwoerd had already carved for himself a permanent place in the history of South Africa. Even when a student at Stellenbosch University, he had shown that he was an exceptional person. As a result, he became a lecturer at a comparatively early age, and his exceptional gifts were the reason why in 1937 he became the first chief editor of this newspaper, the Transvaaler. It was but a short leap from there into the political field, and in 1948 he was elected to the Senate. 2 years later he became a member of the cabinet, and his success in this capacity made it obvious in 1958 that he should become the Prime Minister. In his capacity as Prime Minister, Dr. Verwoerd's name will forever be linked with the establishment of South Africa as a republic. It was through his singleness of purpose, his high idealism, and resoluteness that this form of government, which for many generations had been striven for, became a reality. But now Dr. Verwoerd is no more. This thought pierces the soul of all who knew him or who came into contact with him. It is a harrowing thought for those who at any stage of his life worked closely with him or who experienced the force of his personality and all that went with it. Not only has a great gap appeared in the life of the people, but there is also an empty space which can never be filled. His country and his people are under a great obligation to Dr. Verwoerd. This obligation is to continue along the path which he indicated, a path which he himself in great measure cleared for us. South Africa has a list of names of illustrious men: Piet Retief, Andries Pretorius, Paul Kruger, Martinus Steyn, Christian de Wet, General Koos de Leray, Barry Hertzog, Daniel Malan, and Hans Stradum. To this list of names, Hendrik French Verwoerd was long ago added, and that was the obituary in the newspaper that he once edited. A great South African for sure, although not everyone agreed with his policies, but certainly he was much loved by the people, and an untimely death.
Well, I certainly hope that people listen to that and realize how much maligned Hendrik Verwoerd was, because, as Cuan so clearly pointed out, many of the things for which he is today blamed happened long before he even grew up. He was a child, a babe in arms, when some of these policies were enacted. And with that, we are going to reach a commercial break. We will be back in a few moments. You're listening to Radio Free South Africa with your host, Karin Smith, and our guest, Cuan Elgin, author of that fabulous book, Bulala, A True Story of South Africa. I have had some emails asking me where the book is available and how to spell Cuan's name. So the book is available on Amazon. His name is Cuan, C for Charlie, U, A, N for Nelly, and his surname is Elgin, E, L for Lucky, G for Golf, I, N for Nelly. The book is Bulala, B-U-L-A-L-A. And as I say, it is available from Amazon or from, if you'll hold on one moment, Sacred Truth Publishing in Tennessee. That is Sacred Truth Publishing. I hope that answers many people's questions. Now, having discussed Hendrik Verwoerd and the fallacies of his being the architect of apartheid in South Africa, our next historical personage is going to be Nelson Mandela. Now, I would like you to please just have an open mind and remember how many fallacies have been spread about so many people, historical figures in this world, and just have an open mind and listen to what we would like to tell you about Nelson. Welcome back, Cuan.
Thank you, Karin.
Cuan, Nelson Mandela, the supposed destroyer of this evil apartheid system. I myself am very ambivalent about the man because in some ways he was a great leader, he led his people, but I suppose it's on which side of the fence you're on. The winners write the history, and so for some, to his people, he was a freedom fighter. To other people, he was a terrorist. And it is very hard for me, having lived through that era, to be unbiased about it. Because for me, the murder of innocent people in restaurants, at police stations, at railway stations, that's terrorism. But I do understand that for his people, he was a great father figure, Madiba, father of the people, and a freedom fighter. So you, being well known to keep an unbiased and open mind, you'll probably be educating me as well tonight.
Well, Karin, as a historian, one recognizes that it's men who make history, or women, people make history. But as a historian, I tend to focus more on the times and the context than the person. Mandela was certainly a man of his time, and as the saying goes, comes the time, comes the man. So certainly he had some admirable qualities, which everybody knows about. The media wrote the modern history. As you say, the victors tend to write the history. Well, in this case, the media wrote it and broadcast an image and created a myth which everybody's familiar with. So I won't go too much into that. Everybody knows who Mandela was. Some have called him the greatest statesman of the 20th century. Some have called him the greatest human being that ever lived. Others have called him, as you rightly say, a terrorist. So I would suggest to give a balance, because the media myth is out there. Everybody knows it. Let me give the other side. And I will try to be, as you say, as unbiased as I normally try to be. But as a researcher and a historian of particularly South African history, I've come across stuff which I've exposed in my book, Bulala. Thank you for mentioning that. It was first published in the United States, incidentally, because it was impossible to get it published in South Africa because it didn't toe the popular line. For instance, it has Mandela's charge sheet in it, which makes interesting reading, and we can go into that later. And the publisher would say to me, but why do you have his charge sheet? And he was a hero. And I would say, yes, indeed he was to many people, but his charge sheet is in the public record, yet people don't know it. Yes. So surely this should be also shown that there is another side to the man. Yes. And one that is not known. So after some difficulty, we decided to go to the United States. We still have a modicum of freedom of speech, and it was published there, thanks for mentioning, by Sacred Truth. And you can, as Karin rightly says, get hold of them on the internet, Sacred Truth, or just email the publisher, STM, Sacred Truth, STM at Mounet, MOUNET.com, STM at Mounet.com, and the publisher himself will surely answer you. And the book itself has a lot of detail on Mandela and on the entire era, the apartheid era, which I lived through. So I'd urge you to read it, but I will quote extensively from the book while we talk, because, as I say, it does cover the history of the man quite extensively. But to put it in context, which to a historian is the most important part, as we spoke earlier about Verwoerd, Hendrik Verwoerd, the seventh Prime Minister of South Africa, he was assassinated, of course, in 1966, so that's 50 years ago this year. And roughly halfway through that period, 26 years ago, Nelson Mandela was released. But after Hendrik Verwoerd, the seventh Prime Minister, came Balthazar John Vorster, B.J. Vorster as we called him, was the eighth, and then came P.W. Botha, Peter Willem, or P.W. as we called him, and he would be the ninth, and the 10th would have been F.W. de Klerk, Frederick Willem de Klerk, who was the man who released Mandela, and we'll go into some detail on that. But P.W. Botha, the ninth Prime Minister, was then actually, the title had been changed to President. He offered Mandela an early release. Remember, he'd been jailed for terrorism and sabotage. He'd been given a life sentence. He wasn't executed because they realized this man had potential. He showed leadership qualities. They didn't want to just make him a martyr. So he was actually primed and trained, it'll surprise people, to become the first black president of South Africa whilst he was in jail.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll go into that. But P.W. Botha in the mid-80s offered Mandela an early release. Bear in mind he'd been given a life sentence. At that stage he'd served about 20-odd years. Not all of it on Robben Island, I might add. He only served the first part of his sentence there. He was then moved to a very comfortable cottage on the mainland in the grounds of a much bigger prison, and had a swimming pool and a butler and a chef and so on. So very different picture to what most people have been given. But either way, the Prime Minister at the time, became President P.W. Botha, offered him an early release if he would renounce violence publicly as a means of gaining power for his party, in which case they would sit down and try and thrash out a new future for South Africa. Very magnanimous approach, I think. And he refused. He flat refused to renounce violence, and so PW had no option, the Prime Minister at the time, but to let him sit. He couldn't release a man who still said that violence was the way to get power, to the barrel of a gun.
Absolutely.
Bear in mind that Mandela was a communist. That will surprise people as well. He did eventually, as we know, become the 11th Prime Minister or President of South Africa, the leader of South Africa, and he was a communist. And after him, the 12th was Thabo Mbeki, and he was ousted by the 13th, unlucky 13, Jacob Zuma. So we've got Mandela communist, Thabo Mbeki communist, and Jacob Zuma communist.
Yeah.
And Jacob Zuma also spent time on Robben Island, incidentally. But if those who doubt that Mandela was a communist, do a little bit of research. It's in the public domain now. He, in fact, wrote a thesis in prison called How to Be a Good Communist.
Yes.
So, but like much of his works, it was plagiarized. That'll surprise people as well. In fact, he basically rewrote a communist tract as under his own name, How to Be a Good Communist. Many of his sayings, his sage sayings, were in fact plagiarized or slightly changed. So this is the other side to the man. As I say, he's not around to defend himself, so I'm not here to attack him. I'm here to present the other side. The world has heard the one side, the media, and the hype. This is the other side. So he was transferred to the mainland, as I say. During this time, the nationalists, the Afrikaner nationalists, were still in power, very much so. They built a powerful army to resist the communist infiltration and the incursion. They fought a war in Angola against basically Cuban troops, 50,000 Cuban troops armed with tanks and MiG fighters. South Africa held back communism long enough for the Soviet Union to collapse. So we played a very big role in tying up communism in southern Africa until the Soviet Union collapsed and there was a new dispensation. But as it turns out, the current cabinet of South Africa, which is virtually entirely black, despite it being supposedly a non-racist democracy now, the most liberal constitution in the world, the only white faces you'll see in their cabinet, and there's very few of them, all communists. So that'll tell you something. But either way, to their credit, the white nationalists had allocated, as we mentioned in our earlier talk about Hendrik Verwoerd, many of the finest regions of their country, to the black tribes as homelands, not reservations, but homelands with full infrastructure, reservoirs, roads, hospitals, schools, civic buildings, industries, even airports, and gave them a form of independence, self-governing, etc. But blacks still continued to swarm to the so-called white areas, demanding and receiving housing from the white authorities or establishing squatter camps, which soon became squalorous, crime-ridden ghettos, around the, until then, peaceful, crime-free white settlements. And one by one, largely as a result of liberal political machinations, the many black nations to the north of South Africa, most of which had prospered as European colonies, were given their freedom and became autonomous nations. That was in the time of Hendrik Verwoerd. And the European powers turned over the reins to their former colonies to the natives, as they called them. But nearly as quickly as the European colonial masters pulled out, those countries reverted to, I say reverted to because that's the state they were originally found in, to anarchy, barbarism, brutality, and chaos, and followed by the inevitable economic and agricultural collapse, famine, starvation. And it would take billions of dollars of Western aid to, again, stabilize them and to feed their burgeoning populations. But the liberal Western world would then turn against South Africa, the South African Republic, and its proud tribe of white Afrikaans and English-speaking pioneers. And the West pretty much turned a deaf ear to South Africans, or South Afrikaners, we can call them, attempt to explain why apartheid was a necessary institution in their minds to preserve the integrity of their white Christian African Republic.
Yeah.
As I say, I'm no proponent or not here as an apologist for apartheid, not at all. I always voted against it for different reasons. I always thought a strong opposition was a good thing, even if I didn't necessarily agree with all their policies. But either way, this is the perception that needs to be seen, that the white Christian Republic tried to explain their stance on separate development in separate areas for the different population groups, black and white. But no one listened, of course. But to them, they refused to live or behave like the black Africans, and they required apartheid to maintain law and order and safety and preserve their Christian civilization. Remember, they were a very small minority in the country, never more than 20%, now down to 8%, because the white population stabilized and shrunk, and the black population has burgeoned.
Yeah.
But they saw it as necessary to preserve the racial integrity of their Christian hegemony over the Republic, and certainly that was no crime because all non-white races demanded the same basic right. And the Afrikaners refused to be governed, the nationalist Afrikaners governed by black Africans who consistently opposed them and who had supported an imperialistic invader, Britain, against them in 2 wars, and whose moral standards of the blacks were far different than their own, and as they believed that because God commanded it in his word to remain separate. And they would quote extensively from the Bible. Ezra 9 and 10 is a classic, Joshua 23, etc., where it clearly states that the blood of the race must not be mixed with others and so on. So they had a biblical basis to what they believed. And they refused to allow the independent republic to revert to barbarism, as all the other African countries formerly under European colonialism had done. Although the republics were never really British colonies in a sense. The Cape was, and to some extent Natal. But the Afrikaners, or the Boers as they were known, had existed autonomously before the British came and stole their nation from them. But as mentioned earlier, when we spoke of Verwoerd in his time, the wind of change, as from the speech by the British Prime Minister, was sweeping through Africa, and a virulent liberalism was raging through the West. And then the propaganda of the liberal press and libertine Hollywood moguls would hold a monopoly over impressionable minds. And to put it in the parlance of the day, the noble black savage would be exalted and welcomed with open arms into many European countries, and till to this day, and bringing with them very often a pagan religion, lower standards, many new vices. And instead of enjoying true civilization, they seemingly set about to destroy it or corrupt its institutions. But despite all this, the white Africans, who were the builders of the only true modern civilization in Africa, who brought peace, safety, and prosperity wherever they settled, and industry and civilization, they'd be vilified and become the social pariahs of the world. And South Africa had by then already seceded from the British Commonwealth under Hendrik Verwoerd, and was soon expelled from the United Nations, which a South African, incidentally, Jan Smuts, who we spoke of in an earlier program, he'd helped to establish. And then crippling international sanctions were instituted against South Africa. And strangely enough, it may not occur to many people, or they didn't know, but when South Africa's apartheid law, which essentially means apartness, which Hendrik Verwoerd called a policy of good neighborliness. So he had a very humanitarian approach to it, as he saw the black tribes were not lesser or inferior, but they were at a different stage of development to the white tribe, such. But the apartheid was called a crime against humanity, and the United Nations declared. What people might not remember, on the same occasion, Israel was also declared, or Zionism was declared a crime against humanity at the same time as apartheid was. But it was voted down, whereas the crime against humanity, apartheid, was voted in. So different times, people have forgotten them. Incidentally, when Mandela was jailed, and we'll go into the reasons why he was jailed, Amnesty International at the time, and this is now the early 60s, early to mid-60s, was then approached to take up his cause, or take up his case as a political prisoner as such. And they refused to take his case. They turned it down. They said, no, he's not a political prisoner. He is convicted of many violent crimes, and had received a fair trial and a fair sentence. That's Amnesty International in the 60s. They're considered a very liberal organization now, and I wonder what they'd say now, once he became this great world icon. But at the time, that was the perception, and that's what he had done. And we will go into some detail on exactly what he'd done. But by the way, the Afrikaners saw that they weren't guilty of telling other nations how they ought to live, nor were they guilty, they thought, of oppressing weaker nations around them. In fact, they gave them autonomy, gave them land, gave them infrastructure. Their crime, as it was seen, was to desire to preserve the integrity of their own institutions and their own nations. But, international demands for democracy grew ever more strident, and yet hypocritically, the same liberals studiously ignored the glaring fact that 90% of black African-ruled countries were not democratic, and that not a single Arab-ruled African nation was democratic. But yet, here in South Africa, they were saying, democracy, democracy, knowing full well that there was a massive majority of blacks, so it would be, in fact, a black country immediately after the vote, which is what it turned out to be. But the white African tribe endured, even prospered, and then in cooperation with Israel, I might add, good relations were established with Israel, and they developed a nuclear capability in conjunction with Israel, and also the world's first viable oil from coal facility, which still operates today, and were front runners in many fields: agricultural science, engineering, aeronautics, advanced guidance systems, deep level mining, wildlife conservation, higher education, medical research. And in the 60s, Dr. Christian Barnard was the first man in the world to perform a heart transplant, a South African. As mentioned in the earlier program, the South African rand was twice as strong as the US dollar. And the standard of living of all South Africans was easily the highest in Africa and amongst the highest in the world. But more and more, mostly English-speaking, white South Africans started to join these militant black liberation movements and rallied support in the West for these organizations. And then the South African nationalists, abandoned by the rest of the world, developed the best equipped and most modern army in the Southern Hemisphere to protect the Republic's borders against a violent wave of communist armed and trained black liberation armies building up to the north, supported strangely by many of the nations of the West, and supported very much so, armed and supplied by the two communist superpowers of the day, China and the Soviet Union. So young white boys were conscripted into the army to defend the borders, defend their farms and homes, and the land of their birth, which had been the Afrikaner or Boer, English and Afrikaans white homeland for over 300 years. For the first time, the bloody birth pangs of black consciousness were beginning to be felt in the towns and suburbs, well armed and encouraged from abroad. And as a result, anarchy would soon stalk the once safe streets and ravage the productive, peaceful farms, held back only by the efficiency of the centuries-old rural volunteer commando units. But those were scrapped under the Mbeki administration, the one after Mandela, and as a result, farm murders, as we call them, the attacks, terrorist attacks on our farmers, have gone through the roof. Since the commandos have been scrapped, there's no more protection for the farmers, and thousands have been brutally murdered. But the Soweto riots kicked off while Mandela was in jail, and the students were crying freedom before education and burning down their schools and civic buildings and clinics, all of which had been built by the whites, of course, even cutting down trees and saying they are symbols of colonial oppression because the whites had planted them.
Yeah.
And they would then burn alive, and they did, hundreds of their own people, with the horrific practice called necklacing, putting rubber tires around filled with diesel or petrol and burning the people alive. And this was done under the auspices of the ANC. They were the leading so-called liberation movement of the day. And interestingly, once the dust had settled, there was and Mandela and his ANC had taken over the country in a peaceful settlement. Ultimately, an outfit was set up called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Archbishop Tutu, and they concluded, and this is interesting stuff, that some 500 odd of the white nationalist governments, mainly black political opponents, had been murdered under apartheid. Bear that figure in mind, 500 odd. But 22,000, mainly black, opponents of the ANC-led liberation movement had been murdered. 22,000. So who were the bad guys, one has to ask. Anyway, back to Nelson Mandela. His beginnings were not the simple, poor herd boy that people might have, been told he was. He was in fact born into royalty, a privileged upbringing, although he was adopted and had fostered at one stage because his father had died off. But he was born in 1918, and his full name was Nelson Rolihlahla Dalibunga Mandela. Rolihlahla, incidentally, colloquially means troublemaker in Xhosa, which was his native language. Nelson Rolihlahla literally means he who shakes the tree, essentially troublemaker, oddly. And his father, Gadla Henry Makapanyisa. Sorry, Karin?
Very oddly. They must have known from birth.
He must have looked like one. Well, his father, Gadla Henry Makampanyisa, had 4 wives, and Nelson Mandela was born to the 3rd wife, Nkosikani Fanny Mapukanyiswa. And he, strangely enough, he was adopted by, as I say, one of his relatives, whose middle name was No England, because at one stage the Xhosas and the English had a few dust-ups, 9 in fact, 9 frontier wars as they're called now. They were called Kaffir Wars in those days. The 9 Kaffir Wars in the area that was called Kaffraria by the British, which was Xhosa land, where Mandela came from. But anyway, her name was No England. But it's a common misconception that he was jailed for his political beliefs.
Yeah.
That's what people believe. But in fact, no one was jailed for their political beliefs, even under the darkest days, as you might want to call it, of apartheid. They were jailed for what they did if they broke the law. And in fact, he was acquitted of treason, Mandela, after a 4-year trial, acquitted. But he was rearrested a few years later and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for launching an armed insurrection as founder and commander-in-chief of the ANC's militant wing, which was called Mkhonto Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, or MK as they called it. But here's a few figures to blow the socks off a few Madiba worshippers, as we call them. Madiba, incidentally, was his clan name. It was the clan Madiba. He was, as I say, acquitted of treason and a few years later rearrested and charged with 193 counts of terrorism, for sabotage and for trying to smuggle, prepare or manufacture mostly Soviet bloc munitions, including the other figures: 210,000 hand grenades, 48,000 anti-personnel mines, 144 tons of ammonium nitrate, 21.6 tons of aluminium powder for mixing with the explosives, 1,500 timing devices, and 2,000 pounds of black gunpowder. So these, if you look at the type of weapons, 210,000 hand grenades and 48,000 anti-personnel mines, these were not for attacking armed installations or the army. These were for attacking civilians. They were anti-personnel mines and hand grenades. And among his many co-conspirators were a number of white communists. And his personal pistol was a Makarov, presented to him in Ethiopia by the communist government there. Nelson Mandela's personal pistol, which has never been found. He buried it in Rivonia before his arrest during the armed struggle, which he is quoted as saying it was for killing white policemen. This is dear old Nelson. Anyway, these were clearly not trumped-up political charges, because in his eloquent closing statement to the court, Mandela candidly admitted his guilt on the charge of sabotage, and he added that, if needs be, he was prepared to die for his ideals. He was going to say, apparently, when he wrote out his closing speech, that he's prepared to die for his ideals. His lawyer said he was a little worried that he might just get what he asked for and be executed because of the many people who've been killed in these terrorist attacks. He said, just add, if needs be. So he added, he's prepared to die for his ideals if needs be. Anyway, it was probably good advice from his lawyer. Anyway, it was apparent from the huge amount of smuggled explosives that he certainly wasn't planning to die alone. And it was regarded that he was about to launch a race war, a massive race war in the country with all this huge amount of smuggled explosives and ammunition and arms, which were mostly Soviet bloc. Either way, the judge showed clemency and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. And he wasn't summarily executed, as he would undoubtedly have been in any black African country at that time for the same offences. And in fact, in virtually any Western nation at that time,
yes.
virtually all still had the capital punishment, he would have been executed for those crimes. However, he wasn't. And he conspired not just to bring down the government, he was planning on killing tens of thousands of innocent civilians in his quest for power. And the judge at the trial did, in fact, comment that personal ambition, it's on the record, may well have played a role in his plans. And, of course, Mandela boldly admitted his guilt. He was never tortured during his incarceration or his interrogation before he was incarcerated, as he undoubtedly would have been in any black nation in Africa. In fact, he was generally treated humanely, as I mentioned earlier, by his white captors, eventually being transferred from Robben Island to the mainland and living comfortably in a cottage in the grounds of the prison. As mentioned, he was offered an early release by Prime Minister and then President P.W. Botha in the mid-80s, but Mandela steadfastly refused to renounce his commitment to violence. And even when he eventually did gain an early release under the next President F.W. de Klerk about 6 years later, even when he gained an early release on condition that he commit his party to peaceful negotiations, he still refused to renounce violence. So this is what the government of the day was faced with. They could not countenance having somebody who'd been jailed instead of executed for trying to start an armed insurrection, whatever cause he was representing, however righteous his cause was considered. Innocent civilians being blown up by limpet mines. And my own wife missed being blown up by a few minutes by a limpet mine. I have a friend who was blinded for life. He's still alive, but he's been blind for decades by an ANC bomb in a civilian street. They blew up burger bars. They put landmines on farm roads, indiscriminately killing farmers and farm workers who were mostly black. Attacking civilians. They never took on the army. They didn't seem to have the courage for that. But they certainly attacked civilians in a big way. And this was what the government at the time was dealing with. So however righteous the cause, and however unrighteous apartheid, which had already been dismantled by then, by the time he was released, completely dismantled, under P.W. Botha started it, the dismantling, and then F.W. de Klerk continued it. So by the time Mandela was released, in fact, apartheid was no more. So apartheid was abolished by the white nationalists, not by the ANC, another misconception. But as he walked free from the prison, Mandela, accompanied by his second wife, she was his second wife, Winnie Mandela, not his first, he divorced his first. Her full name was Nomzamo, nicknamed Winnie Madikizela Mandela, born 1936. Mandela raised his fist, as she did, in a Black Power salute. And in the first speech he made as a free man, which was in Cape Town, he announced that the struggle would continue, the armed struggle. And the rest, as they say, is history. He led his communist-aligned ANC to an overwhelming victory in the first fully democratic elections in 1994. And one of the reasons why my book, Bulala, is called that, it might seem an odd title, which is a Zulu word for destroy or kill, but it's totally appropriate. If you read the book, you'll understand. The first time it's recorded was in 1836, when the Boers signed 1838, I beg your pardon, signed essentially a peace treaty, but a land treaty with the Zulus to live alongside them, not on their land, alongside, to live as good neighbors. They no sooner signed the treaty than the Zulu king at the time, Dingaan, shouted out, Bulala abatagati, or Bulala umtagati, which means kill the wizards. They saw the whites as wizards because they had technology, they had guns, and they had lamps and so on. The Zulus had none of that sort, not even an oil lamp, no written language, virtually no technology except an assegai, a spear. So they saw them as wizards, and they slaughtered the Boer emissaries. So that was the first mention of Bulala. And then halfway through the book, roughly during the Anglo-Boer War, there was a British soldier who picked up the unfortunate nickname of Bulala. He was Captain Alfred Taylor, for shooting unarmed or captured Boers and shooting black prisoners as well, taking their cattle, etc. So that was the second one. And then one of the favorite chants, the political rallies to this day of the ANC and various other black parties is Bulala Amabunu, kill the Boers. So nothing much has changed. Mandela, and we'll go back somewhat into his history, but he, of course, as everybody knows, became the first black president of the new South Africa in 1994. And he and de Klerk were well rewarded in advance for their role in this. Mandela and de Klerk shared the Nobel Peace Prize with its $1 million purse in 1993. And affidavits later alluded to Mandela again, surprise for people, having foreign bank accounts in which he paid no tax, and that's according to Business Day, March 10, 2007, according to my research. And in fact, it is said, one can research this, and it's compelling what one finds, is that Mandela fell out with one of the other luminaries in the ANC, Oliver Tambo, of which Johannesburg Airport, which used to be called Jan Smuts Airport, after the great statesman, was now renamed Oliver Tambo Airport, fell out because Mandela was given, in our money, 50 million rand, which was, in its day, close to $50 million of foreign money. To say again?
A substantial sum of money.
Yes, it was a good chunk of money. And he was given this to bring into the country to assist with upliftment projects and so on, under the auspices of the ANC. Well, the money never made it to this country, and the hearsay is that it's offshore, and hence the great wealth of the current Mandela family. All the same, that is another story. But F.W. de Klerk was subsequently divorced from his wife for 39 years. It was a tumultuous period, 1908. And she was murdered, Mrs. Marika de Klerk, in 2001. She apparently didn't share her husband, F.W. de Klerk's liberal views, but she was brutally murdered, strangled and stabbed, and found with a knife still in her back, in her own home, on the safe side of town, killed by her own black security guard. And she was murdered while her ex-husband, F.W. de Klerk, was in Stockholm, Sweden, attending a Nobel Prize Committee function. And her high-profile murder drew sympathy from many circles, even the most unlikely, the second president of the New South Africa, Mbeki, who graciously stated that she was a strong, charming, and dignified woman. But we digress. If we go back to Mandela, there was an interesting character in South African history called Nonkosi. She was a Xhosa, remember that is Mandela's tribe, in the Eastern Cape, which is now known as the Transkei. She was a prophetess, a young girl, about 14, and you will also hear that there's various black tribes lived in peace and harmony and Ubuntu before the coming of the white man. It's a fallacy. There was constant fighting between them, constant cattle thieves. That was the national sport in those days, was cattle thieving and wife stealing. They would raid each other's tribes and villages and steal the cattle and take the women. And the Xhosa at that stage, we pronounced it Xhosa, Xhosa. They were broken up in many clans in those days, the Galeka, the Mvana, and the Tembu, from whose ranks would rise Mandela. That was the royal clan, Tembu. And they were, as I say, constantly at war with each other. And then they faced an unexpected phenomenon in the form of this young girl. And she would be responsible for the devastation of their land and people, which basically destroyed them as a military force, and even threatened their own existence. So this is from the same people as Mandela arose. And if I can quote from Bulala, Nonkosi, or Nonkosi, as the whites called her, was only 14 years old when she managed to convince her people to commit what amounted to national suicide. In 1856, the rather plain-looking, uncharismatic young girl was sitting staring into a pool of water along the Kara River when she allegedly saw a vision of her ancestors. They told her in her vision that they were prepared to return and drive the hated white men back into the sea from whence they had come. But first, as an act of supreme faith in their ability to achieve this, the Xhosa would have to kill all of their cattle and consume all of their crops. So that's showing absolute faith that this will happen. The tribesmen who refused would be magically transformed into frogs, mice, and even ants, and then blown into the sea themselves by a powerful whirlwind conjured up by their ancestors. Nonkosi told her uncle, the village witch doctor, about her vision, and he, duly impressed, approached the tribal chiefs with her in tow, and there she repeated what she'd seen in her vision, and her uncle added his own notion that the Russians, whose army he had presumably heard had recently engaged England in the Crimean War, this was in the 1850s, of course, would arrive timelessly to assist Xhosa in driving out the whites. Of course, due to his scant knowledge of the world outside of the Eastern Cape, was very different to what he knew. He didn't realize that the Russians themselves were white men. Anyway, strangely enough, as we'll see, some of this did come true, because delighted at this prospect of ridding the land of the whites, the Xhosa enthusiastically set about slaughtering their own herds, killing an estimated 200,000 cattle. Great feasts were held, big barbecues, and for the rest of the year they partied as if there was no tomorrow. They'd soon consumed all their own crops. Winter arrived, and their feasting continued on the cattle. Spring arrived, and they didn't bother to plant any crops, and they were convinced that they would never have to work again once they inherited the fat herds and the grain stores of the whites, who they believed, as I said, would be driven into the sea from whence they'd come. Summer came, and their fated day of destiny, February the 18th, 1857, finally dawned. Their teenage seer, their prophetess, had confidently predicted that the blood-red sun would arise that day, but it would stand still above the sea and then change course and immediately set in the east, back from where it had come, and the hated whites would flounder and drown in the waves, leaving all their wealth to the Xhosa. Well, as it turned out, the sun rose on that fateful day, and her people sat waiting expectantly, but the sun continued along its normal course to the summer sky high above them and finally set in the west as it had since creation. And darkness fell on the ruined Xhosa tribe. Starvation soon stalked the land, and the sight of skeletal tribesmen and their families flooding into the settled town begging for food from the whites became commonplace, and the theft of cattle and crops became frequent. And despite the best efforts of the kind-hearted whites trying to feed the starving Xhosas from their own rapidly depleting stores, the self-induced famine claimed the lives of 55,000 Xhosa, about half of their entire tribe. And this came to be known as the Great Cattle-Killing Delusion. And Nonkwazi, who was understandably unpopular by that stage, fled to a white town, and the British authorities arrested and shipped her off to Robben Island for her own safety. But she couldn't have known that a little over a century later, one of her own tribesmen, Nelson Rockefeller Mandela, would also be incarcerated on that same bleak rocky outcrop in the sea looked over by Table Mountain, Robben Island. Mandela would be in prison for attempting to start a race war that would also, his supporters believed, drive the whites back into the sea, leaving to the blacks all their wealth, homes and farms free for the taking. He too, although ultimately more successful in his endeavours, would, in a remarkable twist of fate, also look to Russia for assistance. So her vision, strangely, did come about 100 and odd years later, and the Xhosa tribe, although devastated by the self-induced famine, would rise again, and ultimately one of their own sons, a son of the Royal Tembu clan, would become the first black president of a future new South Africa, and that, of course, was Nelson Mandela. Well, to get back to his political career, he was the founder and commander-in-chief of the militant wing of the ANC. As I say, he was a communist, and that's very well documented. It was kept under the wraps, the fact that he was a communist, because the ANC wanted the support of the West, and they knew if there was any talk of communism in their leadership, the West would be reluctant to support them, so it was kept quiet. But after he died, it came into the fore, and the front page of the Communist, their magazine, their monthly magazine, they had emblazoned all over the front page how their great leader had died, the communist leader Mandela. So people were fooled into thinking that it was all about democracy, but the ANC knew very well that the vast majority of blacks would vote for them. They were the leading, you could say, black-dominated party, so they would win easily, hands down, in a democratic election, and that's exactly what happened. Interestingly, Mandela, who, as I say, came from a reasonably privileged background, not a poor boy by any means. He studied law and went to a white established university, Fort Hare. So did Robert Mugabe, incidentally, the dictator of Zimbabwe, went to the same university. He got his education, and then he opened a law firm with another black attorney in Johannesburg. But a strange thing happened when he was jailed. He was allocated his prison number, and it turned out to be 46664.
Yeah.
And to break it up, it was essentially prisoner number 466 of 1964. But it turned out 46664.
Yeah.
So 4 now the end with the 666 in the middle.
Yeah.
And a lot of white Christians, because of that, they identified this 666 immediately as the number of the beast, which is spoken of in the Bible in Revelations in chapter 13. And but the fundraising music concert organizers, obviously realizing this mark of the beast connotation wouldn't get much support from Christians, they quickly changed it to 46664 instead of 4666.
Yeah. Yeah.
They called it 46664.
Yeah.
But I saw quite a telling picture of Mandela standing with a 46664 T-shirt on, and he had a waistcoat over it which blocked off or obscured the two fours, one on either end, and all you saw was 666. That picture was quickly whipped off the internet.
Yeah.
Either way, a lot of Christians identified him as essentially an antichrist, and there was a lot of resistance to him being president from white folk who saw him as a communist, an immoral person in the sense that he was very quick to sign laws which brought in for the first time into South Africa pornography, abortion on demand, and escort agencies, prostitution, all that.
Gambling as well.
So they were rather taken back those were amongst the first laws that he passed, and that he never ever condemned violence as a means of taking the political power. His wife, in fact, who was really an embarrassment to him eventually, Winnie, during her trial for kidnapping, incidentally, she was put on trial for kidnapping and for being accessory to murder. She had a gang of thugs who worked for her while Mandela was in jail, and she called them her soccer club, the Mandela United Soccer Club, but they were guilty of murdering quite a few of their opponents, black opponents, incidentally. And she had a luxury car, Winnie, and the registration was 666 as well.
Wow.
Quite
wow.
odd. So people picked up on that. Anyway, being who she was, the wife of the great Madiba, because they weren't divorced at that time, she was convicted of kidnapping and accessory to murder and received a fine. Would you believe, a fine? Anyway, in the later years, she was also convicted of theft and fraud. She was ripping off the pension fund of the ANC Women's League. So she was a bad egg. She always has been. And Winnie the Witch, as she was known to those who didn't like her. But anyway, she made an infamous speech once, waving a box of matches and shouting that the ANC were going to liberate South Africa with our matchboxes and necklaces.
Yes.
And she was referring to the horrific practice of placing diesel-filled rubber tires around the necks of people and burning them to death. So that was Winnie Mandela, who is still alive to this day, and still, she was revered as the mother of the nation, which she most certainly wasn't. And when she went to the United States, she was called the Queen of Africa, etc. She's an evil woman, I'll say it straight. I know people who've met her, and they will back it up and say she has an aura of evil about her. She's always involved in some controversy or other, and as I say, for the wife of the future president of South Africa to stand up shaking a box of matches and threatening to necklace people, unacceptable, and that's Winnie Mandela. But again, the media spin made her out this poor, bereaved woman who had to endure oppression while her great husband was in jail, etc. So this is the other side of the story. But the ANC, of course, knew that they would win an election, hands down, and so they were very keen to basically agree to everything when a new constitution was being drawn up. And as long as they could have this so-called democratic election, so they agreed to whatever the other side asked as guarantees or checks and balances, knowing full well that they would have the ability to change all those laws again as soon as they got into power.
Yeah.
So but just to make sure that they would overwhelmingly win, they bust in tens of thousands of Xhosas, who were their main support tribe. It's the second biggest tribe in the country, from their homeland in the Transkei into the cities, and especially to Cape Town, because that was where the most whites were. And coloured folk who see themselves as separate from black folk in South Africa. Strangely, it's a very distinct separation here. You've got the white, coloured, and black separate, and the coloured folk tend to speak Afrikaans, not the Bantu or black languages, and they would tend to vote with the whites. They have very many customs and traditions in common and so on. So the ANC knew that their greatest opposition would come from Cape Town, where the oldest city, where this strong voting bloc would stand against them. So they bust in tens of thousands of their supporters into sprawling squatter camps, which are then established around the city to have loyal voters ready to swing the elections their way. But they still lost Cape Town, or the Western Cape, the only province out of 9 which they didn't succeed in getting. And to this day, although they briefly took over the metropole of Cape Town and lost it to the voters again because they made such a mess of it, that they've never managed to actually take over the Western Cape. But they rule the other 8 of the 9 provinces, and they are by far and away the strongest political party in the country to this day. They generally get 60% and over of the vote, so the opposition parties don't really get a look in. Mandela himself, of course, he had this great charisma. That's definitely something he had in his favor. He had a sort of a grandfatherly, kind of a dignified persona, and people liked him. And he had the ability, in many ways, as we spoke of Jan Smuts in an earlier program, of the common touch, where he appeared to remember people and remember what they spoke about, and he would greet them in a friendly manner, and very much sort of a down-to-earth type of chap. That was his public persona. But there's those sycophants who've backed it up by saying, yes, they knew him well, they were either bodyguards or prison warders or private secretaries or public relations people, and he was this wonderful guy as portrayed. I have heard other people who were also bodyguards, also involved in his public affairs, and who've said quite the opposite, that once he was out of the glare of the cameras, he was not the nicest guy. So that's the other side. But either way, as I say, I'm not here to attack him. He's not around to defend himself. But certainly the world saw him as the great messiah for South Africa. As I say, a lot of people saw him as the Antichrist. Yes. So it's different perceptions. But he rose to walk the world stage, undoubtedly one of the greatest figures of the 20th century. As I say, some people have considered him the greatest statesman who ever lived, etc. I'm sure people in Britain would disagree. They would think of Churchill, perhaps, and Americans would think of their great leaders of the past and great statesmen. But certainly in the African context, he's probably been the greatest statesman in the African context, certainly in the 20th century. And we have to give him his due. He did capture the public imagination, and Hollywood made him into a great hero. He was very good at his PR, probably one of the great coups, and it really, I think, maybe his cleverest move amongst all his political moves was only a year after the ANC had taken over the country, 1994. In 95, there was the World Cup rugby tournament in South Africa.
Yes.
And South Africans are rugby mad. Those who've watched the game in the United States will know that it has some similarities with your football, which we would call gridiron, much more free-running than set moves, although there are the set moves, and without all the armour. So it's a very rough and robust, but very fast and skillful sport, and it's absolutely loved by South Africans. It's a passion here. And the Rugby World Cup came to South Africa, and we had a good team, and we had a good chance of winning. And in during the games, Mandela attended. And when we finally did win the World Cup, it was only a year, remember, after the ANC had taken over. So people were still pretty nervous, certainly the whites, about how things would turn out. This changed everything. They were so thrilled that we'd actually won the World Cup. We'd stood together as a nation. We'd sung our songs together at the rugby tournaments and at the test matches. And we appeared to be a nation on the road to great things. And Mandela very cleverly attended the game that we won, the final, and he wore a shirt matching the captain of the Springbok rugby team. Our rugby team, national team, was the Springboks, named after our national antelope, and he wore the number 6 jersey of the captain, who was Francois Pienaar, and stood alongside him and raised the cup with him, and to great cheers from the stadium. And as I say, it's very much a passion here, and most white people will watch rugby. Quite a few coloured and black folk, but whites virtually all will watch rugby. And so the stadium was packed with them, and they were chanting Mandela, Mandela. They were so chuffed. There was this chap standing up front, holding up the cup, the World Cup. We'd won it. We'd been isolated for decades from world sport because of apartheid. We were back in the mainstream. We were back in the world. We were in the spotlight. We were the flavour of the day. Everything looked wonderful. Unfortunately, that was pretty much the highlight, because everything from there has been downhill. It's sad to say, but when Mandela did step down after his 4-year term, and it was good that he did, because he was getting on a bit and perhaps not quite up to the task by then. He was a good front man, he was a good PR man, but when it came to the actual administration running the country, he had to leave it to others. But he stepped down, Thabo and Becky took over, and things just went from bad to worse. The ANC reinstituted racist laws. Would you believe, after all that trouble to free this country from what they saw as racial oppression and to create a new non-racist South Africa under a new constitution which had been negotiated by all parties, which completely did away with any racial discrimination, what did they do? Mandela's party reinstituted racial laws, and this time against the minority. I think it's the only country in the world where there are laws stacked against the minorities in favor of the majorities, not the other way around. There's no provision made, no protection for minorities. As Zuma, who's the latest president, number 13, he said publicly, what his exact words, I think, were, minorities are less, therefore they should have less rights. That's how democracy works, he said. That's how democracy. So he's lecturing people. The ANC have had democracy for 20 years. He's lecturing people who've had democracy for centuries, and it was, of course, invented over 2,000 years ago. Suddenly, the ANC are lecturing people on democracy, and one of the assumptions is that minorities should have less rights because there's less of them. So they've instituted very onerous laws against the white minority. There are over 100 racist laws against them, banning them from the workplace, barring them from government jobs, barring them from getting government contracts, etc. So as we spoke about the creation of a class of poor whites by the British after the Anglo-Boer War, that has been created again in South Africa now, and skilled people who were very much in the mainstream of the economy have been completely sidelined under the ANC, and unfortunately that is the legacy of Mandela now. We have racism again, we have discrimination again, we have violence, we have the same people who burnt down the schools and the clinics in the 70s.
Are doing it again.
excuse me. Are the generation today who are burning down schools again. Not the youth, but that same generation. I did my training as a journalist during the Soweto riots, and I was in my late teens, 19 years old then, and so were they, the ones, and even younger, who were burning down the schools, and we were documenting it all. And they are now of my age. I'm in my late 50s, and the schools that are being burnt now and the civic institutions, as the ANC riot about the craziest things, that they don't like who their own party has nominated as their local councillor. They'll burn down the local council buildings. If they want to protest against a shortage of housing, they burn down houses. If they want to protest against a shortage of trains, or the trains late, they burn the trains. And this is the adults. This is not the youngsters. This is the youngsters appear to want to learn and study, but their parents are still burning schools and civic institutions like they were in 1976 during the Soweto riots. Nothing has really changed. So that is unfortunately the legacy of Mandela. All the good stuff seems to have gone, and we are now back to square one. And it's a great shame, because this country did have huge potential, and it still has, but we need good leadership. At the moment, we have corrupt leadership. But others will tell you the ANC has always been corrupt to the core. Those who have known them over the decades of the so-called liberation struggle, essentially it was a struggle to take power. It was not to liberate anyone. It was to put themselves in power, and they've done that, and they are looting the country. And yet they have always been, according to those in the know, a very corrupt party, and they have never changed. They're mostly run by communists or Marxists, and that's who they are. And that, unfortunately, is the other side of the legacy of the great Madiba, Nelson Mandela.
That, Cuan, is very sad. True, every word of it true, but very, very sad. And on that note, I'm afraid we've reached the end of tonight's show. Cuan will be back in 3 to 4 weeks with the next episode of Historical Figures of South Africa. Once more, Cuan, thank you very much for all the time that you give to the research and to recording these shows for us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Karin. And I'd just like to say that we still believe that this country can do great things, and it's not all doom and gloom. We love our country, and we want it to be great again, and we're going to do our best to get it there. With your attention and help in the United States, you've always been our friends, and we wish that you would step forward, and even if it comes to the extent of imposing sanctions like you did in the old days, against a corrupt government and a racist government. If it was wrong then, it's wrong now. So we ask you for your support. Thank you very much.